Brilliant. Okay, so today is well, my talk today is less about presenting a solution and more about moaning about a problem. So hopefully some people are going to find this discourse useful. But I do have some solutions at the end, and hopefully that'll be handy for people. So cutting the rubber band of practice. So what do I mean about the rubber band of practice? I like this analogy of a rubber band. When you pull a rubber band, you stretch it, we expect it to snap back. But if you pull it too far, eventually it'll either break or it will never quite return back the same way. And some things are really pervasive. They are built of stronger rubber, and as much as we try to change them over time, they always drift back into their kind of modus operandi, their standard formats. And this is one of my favourite pictures. A lecture at the University of Bologna in Italy in the mid-14th century. What I think I really love about this photo is you have the student sleeping on the back seat. So some things are just, universal. But what can we see from this? Actually, the format of the lecture hasn't particularly changed in a long time. And we could argue the format of the standard lecture hasn't really changed since Socrates. You have somebody in the front speaking to a whole bunch of people. Now, there's been loads of work out there that says that maybe this isn't an ideal format for all things. Yet, this format is still the standard across the higher education sector. Yes, we're doing a lot of really interesting things, but still things kind of transition back to lecture. Now, we've had a year where we've done things very, very differently. We've moved a lot of things online. We've had to maybe teach in smaller groups. Maybe you've been forced into that horrible thing called HyFlex. Now, what will happen once these restrictions are lifted? Will we just let go of this rubber band? Will everything just snap back to the normal? Or are we going to see some lasting change, lasting movements in different directions? This is nothing new. We are constantly changing. Sorry about the camera. We are constantly changing what we do in the sector. The camera should boot back up in a second. I'm sure everybody has memories of some sort of institutional project where everybody was encouraged to do their teaching slightly different. Maybe there was some funding around that, or support, or special forms that you had to fill in, and everyone was nudged in that way. But then maybe a change of leadership, reduction of funding, or maybe reduction of incentives, and things have gone back to the way they were before. Again, we see quite a lot of things across the sector where people have been encouraged into relatively interesting practices, but as soon as that project is deprioritized, things drift back. So what makes the current situation different? What makes the situation where we are now particularly unique? Well, one, it's happened all around the world. We're not, academia is inherently transient space. Academics, professional service staff move between universities. I remember seeing a report, it's a few years old now, that the average length of an academic appointment is like between 4 and 5 years before somebody moves on. So, but now, because this has happened everywhere, the amount of kind of change moving between spaces is that's been slightly nullified. And usually we have a choice. We didn't this time. The restrictions that were applied on teaching and learning were relatively universal and relatively broadly applied. Now, yes, we had some choice about what we were doing, but if your ship is sinking, you don't really have a choice about getting your feet wet. We've had to do some things. So there hasn't really been real behavioural change. We've been told to do something else. It's been a requirement of our occupations, with government guidance. We've made those changes, but we can't say that that was an intrinsic change. It's definitely externally motivated. So are we ready for the snap? Like this picture, if anyone's aware of the Marvel films, that there's this the Infinity Gauntlet, it snaps and half of all things in the world change. I won't spoil the film if you haven't seen it. Now we're going to have another snap. The end of when the restrictions are lifted, we're going to have some people who really want to cling on to the new pedagogies that they've developed, and some people who will very, very quickly, through years of training and so on, will want to move very quickly back to the way that they've done things before. And my feeling is that this is actually going to be more of a teaching and learning challenge than the first transition, the first pivot online. When we had that first pivot online, there was a national global effort. There was general kind of agreement that this is what we had to do. Once the restrictions are removed, there isn't going to be that kind of central driver, that motivated steer in a specific direction. So we're going to end up with a very, very varied practice, which could be brilliant. Could also be quite problematic as well. So have things been stretched too far? There are certain things that I think we will have learned through the lockdown, through the pandemic, that I think people are going to find quite attractive and want to hold on to. Business optimization being one of them. There are elements of our role in universities which are cheaper if they are done online. Certainly, universities tend to be space poor. For example, we've maybe removing people from their offices, maybe putting teams in remote spaces. Maybe that's a way of optimizing business, and maybe that will start looking quite attractive. Transitions into new practice. Again, there's bits about online delivery. There's bits about what we've done this year that have been worked really, really well, and we will do our best to hold on to those. Investment in new infrastructure. There's been huge investments in making campuses. I hate the phrase, so I'm really sorry for using it, but COVID safe. And in the IT and systems infrastructure that have allowed this transition online. History suggests that once universities make an investment in a system, they try and get the very most out of it. So I imagine we'll see that kind of driver coming forwards. Changes in leadership. I've certainly noticed lots of senior leadership posts. You just have to look at jobs.ac. There's been a lot of movement around the sector, and it's going to be interesting to see how this impacts things. Student expectations. We have now for 2 years, if we go back just before, a month before the pandemic, there was an article published saying, I don't do video lectures, and these are all my reasons why, and I will never, ever do it. Now, we've all pretty much moved to video as being a standard or default format in certain contexts. Now, once these restrictions are lifted, are those same arguments going to come back? But now we've shown the students for 2 years that we can do video. I imagine student expectations will remain and will be expected to, they will expect asynchronous content. They'll be able to access lectures in a much more flexible way. New metrics, it is very likely, in fact, I would be very, very surprised if I was to put any money on any prediction. I would expect the OFS to start putting metrics on things like asynchronous content, our lectures recorded. We're already seeing this move in the kind of data that we're having to report, and I would be very surprised if this doesn't come up in the next couple of years.
2 minutes left, Chris.
No problem. And consistency and standardization. So again, I mentioned some people are going to want to go back to their old practices, their chalk and talk, as quickly as humanly possible. Other people are going to want to hold on to some of the really cool bits of tech. Other people have got very used to being in the online space and want to stay there. I've already had a number of students come to me and say, I want to stay online. I don't want to go back into a classroom. Will I be able to study online fully next year? So we're going to have these expectations that are going to drift all over the place. We will never have had so many options. Again, there hasn't been as disruptive a change in education since the invention of the internet. We're going to have a lot of choice over our pedagogies, and it's going to take quite a lot of careful considerations of what we move forward. So how do we survive the rubber banding? I have some ideas, and actually it ties in really nicely to the previous talks. One thing I would say is I think we need to do components analysis of practice. We need to stop looking at things as a lecture or a seminar, but ultimately what the components of that. What are the different communication channels? For example, I've really liked having chats in my seminars. It's given really quiet, really shy students a voice. I want to hold on to that. So I want to hold on to that communication channel, even if I go back to a face-to-face. So we need to start looking at components analysis. We want to create structures that facilitate the behaviours we want to encourage. How do we make the transition to better, stronger practices easier than snapping back to old ways of doing things? Some of those old ways might still be the best, but how do we facilitate? How do we create structures that facilitate that change? Engage students proactively. I'm a big advocate for student engagement. I think students can be absolutely experts of their own learning. They know how they like to learn. They know how they like to be taught. And actually engage them in that process, I think, will be really useful over the next year. And share practice often and with as wide an audience as possible. I think if we've learned anything from the pandemic, sessions like this, I do my own set of sessions, Pedagogy and Pancakes. There's been a whole range of podcasts. I don't think we've ever shared teaching and learning practice as broadly and as quickly as we have been doing recently. Now, if you want to know about more of my rants, they're all on my website, headleand.com. I did promise I have a solution for some of this, and I mentioned content components analysis. I have a framework which I've put there, lncn.ac/i3 context. That's got my framework in there, and hopefully some people will find it useful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. I think a lot of people are going to find that really useful. And you had so many good points in your presentation there that I really agree with as well. I think my colleague Steve is going to ask some of the questions in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. We've got the first one here from Martin, obviously agreeing with Chris that this is going to be a huge L&T challenge going forward for the next academic year for sure, for all manner of logistical and uncertainty reasons. But can everyone, sort of do a return to campus? Will COVID still prevent this optimistic outcome?
So right, okay. I think we need to be realistic.
Yeah.
Certainly, we don't know what the future is exactly going to hold. At least in my planning with my team, I'm telling everyone to plan for, the best but assume the worst. We might go back into a lockdown. Who knows? The hope is with the vaccinations going around that we won't. But I imagine at least there's going to be levels of social distancing and etc. At least in the first semester, if not the second. What I think that might mean is there is a slow transition, but I certainly think after summer we're going to see a lot of return to campus, because there is a government push to do that. There's certainly an institutional leadership push to do that. So yeah, I don't think it's optimistic. I think it's likely.
Excellent. How much time have we got, Phil?
I think we've got time for one short one.
One more. Okay. There's a few here, Chris. So if you can have a look in the chat after we've sort of done here, but there's one here about it's an interesting one here. With regards to who creates the new structures. All the learning has been done by teachers this last year, not the academic managers. Are they going to listen to and be guided by the academic teachers so they plan good structures? Do you think there needs to be a sort of synergy between the two?
Yeah, so one of the things that sometimes concerns me is the perceived conflict between the two areas. You've got your learning designers on one side with their pitchforks, and you've got the academics on the other side with their spears, and it seems like a big argument. I think you need to respect the expertise that's coming in from both sides. Academics have to be the denizens of their subject discipline. There's things that I know about how my subject is best taught because I've taught it for 10-15 years. What I'm not the expert in is the facilities, the structures around that, and ways that I can optimize the kind of learning transmission, and how I can see that fit within a larger context. And again, a student's journey, I always say one of the big mistakes we have in universities is we don't have a credits reel at the end of a lecture. We don't say this lecture was brought to you by bum 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 bum. We assume the person in the front is the entire process. Students' learning community is huge, and I think it's always a risk when you have academics who box off their module into this little micro universe and don't look at how that fits into the larger scope. So yeah, I think actually one of the things that we've learned from the last year is the different skills that people are bringing forward. And I would really hope that these designs and these structures and these facilitations are being done more holistically. Certainly that's what we're doing our very best at Lincoln to do.
Thank you, Chris.